The early morning sun painted the vast Wyoming territory in a wash of gold and amber as Catherine Verne stood defiantly on the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, her heart pounding as rapidly as the approaching hoofbeats. It was 1883, and at 22 years old, she had already been widowed, abandoned, and now worst of all pitted by every soul in town who watched her wait faithfully each day for a man most believed would never return. "You're making a spectacle of yourself again, Catherine," Mrs. Langley called from the general store porch, her voice dripping with condescension. "Henry Hawkins rode out months ago. A man like that doesn't make promises he intends to keep." Catherine tightened her grip on the worn letter in her hand, the paper so delicate from countless readings that it threatened to tear along its well-worn creases. "He said he'd come back when he had something to offer," she replied, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that sometimes crept into her heart during lonely nights. "And I believe him. Hope is for fools," Mrs. Langley scoffed, shaking her head as she returned to sweeping. "Especially out here." Catherine had heard it all before. The whispers as she passed by. Foolish girl. Poor thing. Waiting on empty promises. But they hadn't seen what she had seen in Henry's eyes when he'd promised to return. They hadn't felt the gentle strength in his hands when he'd placed the letter in hers, or understood the determination in his voice when he'd spoken words that sustained her through each passing day. "Hope is what I'll build us on," he had whispered against her hair before mounting his horse and riding west. "And I've never built anything that didn't last." The approaching rider wasn't Henry, it never was, just the weekly mail carrier whose sympathetic glance told her there was once again nothing for her. Catherine squared her shoulders and turned back toward the schoolhouse where she taught. Hope might make her appear foolish to others, but it was the only thing she had left to hold on to. She had first met Henry 8 months earlier when his cattle drive had stopped in Redemption Springs. Unlike the other cowboys who spent their pay on whiskey and women at the saloon, Henry had appeared in her classroom doorway one afternoon, hat respectfully in hand, asking if he might borrow a book for the long journey ahead. "Madam," he'd said, his voice gentle despite his imposing figure, "I've been told you have the finest collection of books between here and Denver." Catherine had been startled by the request and even more surprised by the man making it. Tall and broad-shouldered, Henry Hawkins had the weathered look of someone who lived beneath the open sky, but his eyes held an intelligence that immediately set him apart from the typical drifters passing through. "What sort of book might interest a cowboy, Mr. Hawkins?" she had asked, curious and slightly amused. His smile had transformed his face. "The kind that reminds a man there's more to life than dust and cattle." That simple exchange had been the beginning. 5 days was all they had before his drive moved on. But in those 5 days, they had shared more meaningful conversations than Catherine had experienced in her entire life. Henry spoke of his dreams to establish his own ranch, of the beauty he found in the wilderness that others only saw as harsh and unforgiving. Catherine shared her love of teaching and her belief that even in this rough frontier, minds could be nurtured and spirits uplifted through education. By the 5th day, Catherine knew she had found something rare and precious. When Henry asked if he might write to her, her heart had nearly burst with joy. When he'd promised to return once he had secured land and begun building their future, she had believed him without question. Now, months later, that belief was being tested daily. Inside her small classroom, Catherine arranged primers and slates for tomorrow's lessons. The school board had nearly dismissed her when rumors spread about her attachment to a passing cowboy, but her teaching skills and the shortage of qualified teachers in the territory had saved her position. "Miss Verne." A small voice interrupted her thoughts. 10-year-old Emma Henderson stood in the doorway, clutching a wildflower. "Mama says I shouldn't give you this because it encourages your foolishness. But I think everyone needs pretty things when they're sad." Catherine's throat tightened as she accepted the simple purple blossom. "Thank you, Emma. And you can tell your mother that accepting beauty where we find it is never foolish." After Emma left, Catherine placed the flower in a small cup of water on her desk. The child's kindness reminded her why she remained in Redemption Springs despite the whispers. These children needed someone who believed in possibilities. As the sun began to set, Catherine gathered her things and walked to her small rented room behind the milliner's shop. Her landlady, Mrs. Patterson, was one of the few who refrained from commenting on Catherine's daily vigils, though her eyes often held a mixture of concern and pity. That evening, as Catherine sat by her window rereading Henry's letter for the 100th time, Mrs. Patterson knocked softly on her door. "I've brought some stew," she said, placing a covered bowl on the small table. "A woman needs her strength, especially one carrying hope as heavy as yours." Catherine looked up, surprised by the gentle words. "Do you think me foolish too, Mrs. Patterson?" The older woman sighed and sat on the edge of the bed. "I think this territory isn't kind to dreamers, my dear. But then, nothing worth having comes without risk." She patted Catherine's hand. "My William courted me for 2 years before we married, and people said he'd never settle down. We had 43 beautiful years together before pneumonia took him last winter. I feel it in my heart that Henry will return," Catherine confessed. "Is that naive?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Patterson replied honestly. "But I've lived long enough to know that sometimes, very rarely, the heart knows things the mind cannot explain." She rose to leave. "Eat your stew before it gets cold." After Mrs. Patterson left, Catherine opened her journal and added another entry to the hundreds she had written since Henry's departure. She described the purple flower from Emma, the golden sunset, and the strange comfort she'd found in her landlady's words. If when Henry returned, she wanted to share every day they had been apart. The next morning dawned with an unusual commotion in the normally quiet town. Catherine hurried through her morning preparations, curious about the raised voices and increased activity. As she stepped onto the street, she saw a crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. "What's happening?" she asked Mr. Collins from the bank as he hurried past. "Train robbery," he replied without slowing. 20 miles east. Sheriffs gathering a posse. Catherine's heart sank. Violence was an unfortunate reality of frontier life, but a train robbery so close to town would put everyone on edge. It would also mean the sheriff and his deputies would be absent, leaving Redemption Springs vulnerable. At the schoolhouse, several parents had already decided to keep their children home, and only half her usual pupils appeared for lessons. Catherine carried on as normally as possible, though her thoughts kept drifting to the danger beyond their town. "Is it true that train robbers shoot everyone they see, Miss Verne?" asked Daniel Cooper, his 7-year-old face serious with worry. "No, Daniel," Catherine reassured him. "Most robbers only want valuables, not to harm people, and the sheriff will ensure they're brought to justice." She hoped her words were true, though the West had seen its share of ruthless outlaws who valued human life far less than gold or revenge. That night, Catherine double-locked her door and kept a candle burning as she listened to the unusual silence of a town holding its collective breath. The next day, more rumors spread. The robbery had been brutal, with 2 passengers killed and the express car looted of a substantial payroll bound for a mining operation. The outlaws had vanished into the vast wilderness that surrounded Redemption Springs. Some townsfolk whispered that the gang might seek refuge in their isolated community before continuing to the territories where lawmen feared to follow. Days passed with the town existing in a state of nervous vigilance. Men walked the streets armed, and women traveled in groups. Catherine continued teaching, though her morning vigils for Henry's return were temporarily abandoned in favor of hurrying directly to the schoolhouse. It was nearly a week after the robbery when Catherine woke to the sound of horses in the pre-dawn darkness. Peering cautiously from her window, she saw 5 riders moving slowly down the street, their features obscured by the dim light and pulled-down hats. Something about their furtive movements sent a chill through her body. The outlaws had come to Redemption Springs. Catherine dressed quickly, her mind racing. The sheriff and most able-bodied men were still out searching for the robbers. Unaware the criminals had doubled back to the town. She had to warn someone, but making any obvious moves might alert the riders that they'd been spotted. With trembling hands, she slipped out her back door and circled behind the row of buildings. The town was just beginning to stir, with the baker already at work and lights appearing in a few windows. Catherine reached the back of the telegraph office just as Mr. Peterson, the operator, arrived to open up. "Mr. Peterson," she whispered urgently, startling the man. "I believe the train robbers are in town." 5 riders, moving suspiciously down Main Street. Peterson's eyes widened. "Are you certain, Miss Verne?" "No," she admitted. "But better safe than sorry. Can you get a message to the sheriff?" Peterson unlocked his door. "I'll try, but if they're robbers, they'll likely cut the telegraph lines or come here first." Catherine nodded grimly. "I need to warn others quietly. If those men realize we're alerting the town, they might become violent." Moving from building to building, Catherine spread the warning. Some dismissed her concerns, but others took them seriously, especially when distant gunshots confirmed trouble had indeed arrived in Redemption Springs. The shots came from the direction of the bank, and Catherine's blood ran cold. Her classroom full of children would be arriving soon, walking straight into danger. She ran toward the school, intercepting several families on the way and urging them to return home and spread the word no school today. As she reached the schoolhouse, she saw 3 children already waiting on the steps. Just as she was about to call out to them, she felt a strong hand clamp over her mouth and an arm wrap around her waist, pulling her backward into the shadow between buildings. "Don't scream," a familiar voice whispered against her ear. "Those men are watching the street." Catherine froze, then relaxed as the hand slowly released her. She turned to find herself staring into the face she had dreamed of for months. "Henry?" she gasped, disbelieving. His face was thinner, more weathered than she remembered, but his eyes still held the same warmth. "Hello, Catherine," he said softly, his gaze drinking in her face as though memorizing it anew. "You're here. How, why?" So many questions crowded her mind that she could barely form words. "I was on my way back to you when I ran into the sheriff's posse," Henry explained quickly. "When I learned what happened, I rode ahead. Good thing I did." His expression darkened. "Those men are Calloway's gang. They've killed before and won't hesitate to use anyone in town as leverage against the law." "The children," Catherine whispered, looking toward the schoolhouse. "I'll get them," Henry promised. "But first I need you safe." The gunfire from the bank increased, and shouts echoed down the street. Catherine clutched Henry's arm. "This isn't how I imagined your return," she said, attempting a weak smile. Henry's hand covered hers, warm and solid. "I promised I'd come back, didn't I? Though I was hoping for a more peaceful homecoming." His eyes softened. "I heard about your daily waits." The sheriff mentioned a schoolteacher who never lost faith. Catherine's cheeks warmed. "They called me foolish." "Then we're both fools," Henry replied, squeezing her hand. "Because I've thought of nothing but returning to you every day." A crash from the direction of the bank interrupted their reunion. "The sheriff and his men are about an hour behind me," Henry said. "We need to keep everyone safe until then." Moving carefully, Henry managed to reach the children at the schoolhouse and direct them to the safety of the church basement, where many townspeople were already gathering. Catherine helped organize the frightened citizens, establishing a makeshift refuge while Henry joined the handful of men preparing to defend the town. The standoff lasted for tense hours. 2 of the outlaws had been wounded during the bank robbery, slowing their escape and forcing them to seek refuge in Redemption Springs. Now cornered, they grew increasingly desperate, threatening to burn the town if not given horses and supplies for their escape. When the sheriff finally arrived with his posse, the outlaws found themselves surrounded. A brief but intense gun battle erupted, leaving one outlaw dead and the others surrendering rather than face certain death. In the aftermath, as the townspeople emerged from their hiding places and the sheriff secured the prisoners, Catherine found Henry leaning against the hitching post outside the schoolhouse, a bloodied bandage wrapped around his upper arm. "You're hurt," she gasped, rushing to him. "Just a graze," he assured her. "Seems I couldn't return to you without some dramatic gesture to prove my devotion." Despite the tension of the day, Catherine laughed. A simple hello would have sufficed. Henry's expression grew serious. "Catherine, I've come back with more than just myself to offer you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I secured land, just as I promised. 200 acres with a creek running through it, 15 miles west of town." Catherine took the deed with trembling hands. "You really did it. I told you hope is what I build on." His eyes held hers. "I've started a cabin, though it's modest. I can teach at the new school they're building in the settlement nearby." Catherine pressed her fingers gently to his lips. "The cabin, the land, they don't matter. You came back. That's all I needed." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The town celebrated the capture of the infamous Calloway gang, and Catherine found herself no longer the object of pitying glances but rather curious, sometimes admiring ones. The woman who had faithfully waited was vindicated. Her foolish hope transformed into enviable intuition overnight. Henry stayed in town while his wound healed, boarding at the hotel but spending every available moment with Catherine. They walked together in the evenings, making plans and sharing stories of their time apart. Catherine showed him her journal entries, and Henry described the land he had secured and the small cabin he had raised with his own hands. "It needs a woman's touch," he admitted one evening as they sat on the schoolhouse steps. "And bookshelves. I promised myself I'd build you the finest bookshelves in the territory." 2 weeks after Henry's return, they were married in a simple ceremony in the town church. Mrs. Patterson cried openly, while many of the same townsfolk who had called Catherine foolish now whispered about the romance of it all. Even Mrs. Langley brought a wedding gift, a fine quilt she claimed to have been saving for a worthy occasion. After the ceremony, Henry helped Catherine onto the wagon he had brought to town, loaded with her few possessions and wedding gifts. As they prepared to depart for their new home, Emma Henderson ran forward with a bouquet of wildflowers. "I knew you weren't being foolish, Miss Verne, I mean Mrs. Hawkins," the child said proudly. "Sometimes you just have to keep believing." Catherine leaned down to hug her. "That's a lesson worth remembering, Emma. Perhaps you'll be a teacher someday too." As they drove away from Redemption Springs, Catherine looked back at the town that had been both her refuge and her trial. "Will you miss it?" Henry asked, noting her gaze. "Parts of it," she admitted. "The children especially. But I'm ready for our new beginning." The journey to their homestead took most of the day, and the sun was setting when Henry finally pointed to a distant structure nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Our home." The cabin was indeed modest, just as Henry had described, a single room with a stone fireplace, sturdy walls, and a roof that didn't leak. But Catherine saw beyond its simplicity to the care that had gone into every joint and beam. As promised, empty bookshelves lined one wall, waiting for her collection. "It's not much yet," Henry said, suddenly uncertain as he watched her explore the small space. "But it's perfect," Catherine interrupted, turning to him with shining eyes. "Because it's ours." That night, as they lay in their new home with the vast Wyoming sky spread above the roof, Catherine asked the question that had lingered in her mind for months. What kept you going all that time? What made you so certain this would work? Henry was quiet for a moment, his hand gently stroking her hair. When I was a boy, he finally said, my father lost everything in a fire, our home, our livestock, nearly his life trying to save it all. I remember him standing in the ashes the next morning, my mother weeping beside him. Henry's voice grew distant with memory. He looked at the destruction for a long time, then turned to her and said, well, Sarah, looks like we get to build something even better. And they did. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at Catherine. That's when I learned that hope isn't just wishing for something, it's the foundation you build on when everything else has burned away. Some called it stubborn, others called it foolish. But I saw what it created. Catherine reached up to touch his face, memorizing its contours in the dim light. And now you've built this. This is just the beginning, Henry promised. The land needs work, and the cabin needs expanding. But we'll build it together, step by step. In the years that followed, Catherine and Henry did exactly that. The small cabin grew into a proper house with separate rooms and a covered porch where Catherine would sit and grade papers after she began teaching at the nearby settlement school. The empty bookshelves filled with volumes ordered from Denver and St. Louis, creating a library that drew visitors from miles around. They added a barn, corrals, and grazing cattle. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, arrived 2 years after their wedding, followed by a son, William, 18 months later. The land flourished under Henry's careful stewardship, and Catherine's reputation as an educator grew throughout the region. Visitors from Redemption Springs occasionally brought news of the town, how it had grown, how the railroad had finally reached it, how Mrs. Langley still ran the general store but had softened somewhat in her advancing years. Emma Henderson had indeed become a teacher, writing to Catherine for advice when she secured her first position. 5 years after they settled on their land, Henry and Catherine hosted a harvest gathering that drew neighbors from miles around. As the sun set and fiddle music filled the autumn air, Henry found Catherine standing at the edge of their property, looking out over the valley that had become their home. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Catherine leaned into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. Do you remember what the townspeople used to call me?" "Ah, yes, that foolish woman waiting on promises," Henry chuckled. "Though I prefer that wise woman who knew a good thing when she saw it." Catherine turned in his arms. "You know what the Peterson twins were calling our place? Hope Ranch. Apparently that's what everyone calls it now." Henry's face broke into a wide smile. "Hope Ranch," he repeated. "That's fitting, don't you think? Since hope is what we built on." "And look what we've built," Catherine said, gesturing to the thriving homestead behind them, the house with lights glowing from every window, the barn full of healthy livestock, the fields harvested and ready for winter, and most precious of all, their children playing with the other youngsters in the yard. As they stood together watching the life they had created, Catherine thought of that day in Redemption Springs when Mrs. Langley had scoffed at her for waiting, for hoping. How different her life would have been if she had listened to those voices instead of the quiet certainty in her heart. "We should make it official," Henry said suddenly. "The name, Hope Ranch has a good, solid sound to it." Catherine nodded. "Yes, it does." That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Henry and Catherine sat on their porch beneath a blanket of stars. The vastness of the Wyoming territory spread out before them, no longer an untamed wilderness but a place they called home. The challenges had been many harsh winters, dry summers, isolation, and the constant work required to wrest a living from the land. But they had faced each one together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't waited?" Catherine asked softly. Henry was quiet for a long moment. "I would have come back anyway," he finally said. And I would have searched every town between here and the Mississippi until I found you. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. But I'm mighty glad you had the faith to wait. It wasn't just faith in you, Catherine admitted. It was faith in myself, in what I felt. Everyone was so certain I was wrong. Sometimes I questioned my own judgment. But deep down I knew. Henry nodded. That's the thing about hope. It's not blind faith, it's seeing possibilities others can't yet imagine. As they sat together in the quietness of their hard-won peace, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a brief meeting in a frontier schoolhouse to a life built on promises kept and dreams realized. The woman called foolish for hoping had found her answer in a cowboy who understood that hope wasn't just an idle wish but the very foundation on which lives and loves could be built. And on that foundation, they had built something that would last for generations to come, a legacy not just of land and livestock, but of the power of believing in possibilities even when the whole world called you foolish for it. Hope Ranch, Catherine whispered, testing the name again. Our hope, our ranch, our life. Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. And it's only just beginning.